Well, friends, today we have a story that we all know, and I want to dive in because there's just a big challenge in this wonderful story that, again, is so familiar. So I'm just going to dive right in. Let's start by setting the stage. Our location for our story today, Jesus, he's up north. He's in Galilee. We're told he's near the Sea of Galilee. And in fact, that nearby, he goes up a mountain with his disciples to spend some time together. And this is an unnamed mountain for us. It might just refer generally to the hill country that surrounds the Galilee area. But the point, Jesus and his disciples, they're out in the wilderness. They're out in the middle of nowhere, and they're far from the cities and far from the markets. And immediately we find that Jesus is not alone with those disciples, but rather crowds have followed because of the signs that they have seen Jesus perform. And when we see that language of signs in the Gospels, that's referring to miracles. The idea was something impossible, something that only God could do, because then that meant that God was with the prophet or with the person working those miracles. So again, there's a big crowd of people. How many people are there? Call it out for me. 5,000. We're told at first a large crowd, and it's when they go to sit down that we're instructed that there were about 5,000 in all. It's important to keep in mind here, particularly in the Gospel of John, the noun that is used for the word they, as in they sat down, that's a male noun. So 5,000 men sat down as opposed to everybody. Other versions of this same story in the other Gospels, they make this same point. Take Matthew chapter 14, Matthew's version, and those who ate were about 5,000 men besides women and children. So there were 5,000 men plus women and children present. So if there were as many women as there were men present, this would be the feeding of the 10,000. And if, let's say, half those ladies had a couple kids with them, this would be the feeding of the 15,000. Or maybe the feeding of the 20,000. So while the popular name for this event has been called the feeding of the 5,000, it's worth noting Jesus, he feeds way more than 5,000 people, because let us affirm together, all those women and children, they count just as much as the men. Amen? Amen. Amen. So Jesus, he's teaching all these crowds up upon the mountain, but there's a practical issue that is raised. The day it passes, and the people, they're staying, they're hungry for Jesus, and now it's dinner time, and now they're just getting physically hungry. And remember, there's nowhere nearby for them to buy any food. Now in John's version, it's Jesus who raises this concern. Jesus, he turns to Philip saying, where are we going to buy bread for these people? And the gospel writer is quick to point out, Jesus, it's not that he doesn't know the answer. He asked this to test his disciples. And Philip, we're told, is pragmatic. Well, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little, we are told. So not only are they out in the middle of nowhere, far from the city, far from the marketplace, but they don't have any resources to buy all this food, and that would just be for one meal for thousands of people. Yet another disciple, he steps up with a potential solution, and that's Andrew, Simon Peter's younger brother. He steps up with just a little bit of food, and we all know what the food is. It's 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now when you think of those loaves, think of pita bread. Think of those little flat breads. Don't think a large round loaf. Think of flat bread, that is unleavened bread. It's important to include that while pita bread is unleavened, we're told that this whole story occurs near Passover time. And of course, Passover was that special meal that the Jewish community ate that involved unleavened bread, as they remembered the Israelites leaving Egypt, and they were in a hurry and they didn't have time for the bread to rise, and so it was unleavened bread. And so make that connection. If you'll also allow one more side note, can I get that slide? This slide is of a tile mosaic and of these very elements, the bread and the fish that are gathered together. And this tile mosaic is taken from the floor of a church that's located on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. The church is called the Church of the Multiplication, as in the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. And it's believed to be on the very spot that this miracle takes place. This mosaic itself dates back to the 5th century, so it's quite famous. But back to Jesus here. So again, Jesus, he's presented with these elements, the 5 loaves and the 2 small fish. But as Andrew points out, what are they among so many people? But friends, there's another detail here, and it only appears in John's Gospel. And that is the source of those 5 loaves and those 2 fish. From where do the disciples get that bread and the fish in the first place? And the answer is an unnamed boy. Andrew says, well, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And that's an enormous detail, because this entire feeding moment, it begins with one small boy's generosity. Now, friends, there's a lot we do not know here in this moment. Who this boy is, what his name is, what prompts his offering of food. Do the disciples ask around for donations? Does the boy overhear Jesus' question? We do not know. But what we do know, when there was a need, this boy, he donates everything he has, offering it to Jesus to meet the hunger of those around him. And in response, Jesus, he takes this boy's gift and he feeds an entire multitude. Now, friends, I am quick to affirm the miraculous nature of this account. That Jesus, he takes those 5 loaves and those 2 fish and he blesses them and he distributes them and he initiates a miracle of multiplication. That is a sign of God's abundance. Jesus, he multiplies that bread and that fish, and he feeds that whole multitude of at least 5,000 people, but probably a lot more, like 20,000. And again, I'm quick to affirm the miracle here. But today I want to raise a different interpretation of this story, because there's a whole other approach to understanding this feeding of the 5,000 or of the 20,000 than just the traditional explanation of miraculous multiplication. For it has been suggested that what happens here is not so much a miracle of multiplication, but really a miracle of generosity. The generosity that begins with a young unnamed boy who offers up his lunch. But then it's suggested that that boy's initial act of generosity, it prompted generosity in others too. That just as the boy shared what he had, so too did others begin to bring out what they had brought. And they began to share too. And as each individual and family shared what they had, we find that everyone was fed. Everyone had their needs met when everybody started to share with their neighbors. Now, friends, that might seem like a radical interpretation, because if you're like me, a big part of this story, it's grounded in Jesus' power and authority, and he feeds the people. But there are moments here, too, that help us to underscore this emphasis on generosity. For instance, immediately after the boy offers up his sack lunch as a donation, Jesus, he responds by having all the people sit down together in groups. And that implies community. Now, this event of the feeding, it appears in all 4 Gospels. And this is a detail which is consistent in all 4 tellings, that all the people sit down together to eat. It's in Mark's version, from Mark chapter 6, that specifies that they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. The point being, the people didn't all sit down in one giant group of 5,000 or of 20,000, and everybody was a stranger, and all the people around you were just faceless masses to one another. No. Rather, you sat down in small groups where you could see eye to eye. with the people around you. In fact, we're explicitly told Jesus ordered the people to sit down. He directs them to sit together and to break bread together. Jesus, he creates this moment of community. Now, friends, imagine that it's you. Imagine you are the one and sitting in a group of about 50 people, and it's dinner time, and now in your knapsack you brought along a little something for yourself. But certainly not enough to sustain the other 50 people sitting around you. You only brought enough for yourself, maybe your immediate family. And so you get out your fish tacos, or whatever it is you brought, and you begin to distribute to your immediate family. But then as you do, you notice that the people sitting next to you, they didn't bring anything. Maybe they didn't think to bring anything. Maybe they didn't have anything to bring. Maybe they didn't realize that this teaching by Jesus was going to be so wonderful and they would want to stay all day. But put yourself in that moment. Would you share with your neighbor? Even if it meant a little less for you, I bet you would share. Now take it further. Imagine that the rabbi and the teacher and the prophet that you had turned out to hear, he and his students were asking around for donations of food to share. And as that request goes out, it's one small boy is the one to get up, and he offers his meal. What if it's just one boy who answers that teacher's invitation? How might that motivate you to share what you have? Because I bet in this moment you would share too, and you would participate in this miracle of generosity. That together as community you would sit down to eat, and together as community you would join the teacher in praying over the blessing, and together as community you would share what each other had brought. Hey, let me try some of your potato salad. Here, eat one of these cookies that my spouse made. It's like a Methodist potluck just kind of breaks out in this moment. And in the end, when everyone had eaten and had been satisfied, what did they have left over? When they started, all they had were 5 loaves and 2 little fish, barely a box lunch. And yet when they end, there's 12 baskets full of leftovers. And just as I love the understanding that this is a miracle of multiplication, so too am I challenged by a different take of a miracle of generosity that begins with Jesus, and it continues with one small boy's gift, but then it's carried out by all the people as they share with one another and they meet each other's needs. And as the people shared, they saw that no one went home hungry and no one was excluded from the meal. And they shared in abundance together. Now that's a beautiful picture of the kingdom of God. And while it's an event that was begun and directed and blessed by Jesus, it was also an event that hinged upon one boy's gift, who gave everything that he had. And friends, whether that miracle was of multiplication or it was a miracle of sharing, it still started with this young boy. That when Jesus raised up a need, it was this humble boy who answered, and no matter how we interpret the miracle, we can't deny the importance of one boy's generosity. Because sometimes that's all it takes. All God is looking for to feed thousands of men, women, and children is just one person to volunteer and to give their all and to share what they have. And God, He can take that generous heart and He can feed a multitude. Maybe we're talking about feeding people's bodies here, but this could also be feeding people's souls, feeding people the truth, feeding people hope, people who are hungry for the good news of God's love in Jesus. So where in our lives might we be encountering Christ who's asking us, what resources do we have? What can we use to feed the people? Friends, when and where is Jesus asking us to be like that boy and share what we've got so that Jesus can take it and feed a multitude? Because friends, imagine the opposite. What happens to this event if there was no boy? What if instead of sharing his bread and his fish, this boy, he decides, well, I barely have enough for myself. I better keep what I have. What if Jesus and his disciples ask around for donations and no one offers to share? How might the absence of this generous boy change the story? Or would there even be a story? Without that initial gift, would there have been a feeding? Would there have been a meal? Or would everyone have gone home hungry? I don't think it's a stretch to suggest we might assume, well, Jesus would have taken care of it. That if Jesus, he needed some fish and some bread to start his miracle, then the Son of God, he wouldn't have any problem just making those up out of thin air, right? What's one miracle on top of another? That would be nothing for Jesus. He could just make that fish and bread out of nothing. He could just take a stone off the ground and turn it into a loaf of bread and feed people that way, right? Oh, wait. Does that idea about changing stones into bread, does that spark anything for anyone? Because there's a different story in the Gospels that involve that, right? In fact, that idea of Jesus turning stones into bread to meet physical hunger, that was an idea who was raised up by who? There you go. It was the devil who came up with that idea. The one moment in the Gospels where Jesus and the devil square off in Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. Friends, we're getting down to the end of the message here, so I only want to touch base on this first temptation briefly. But if you recall, early in the Gospels, Jesus, before he begins his public ministry, he's baptized by his cousin John in the Jordan, and then he's led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasted and prayed for 40 days. And it's after that time that we are told Jesus was famished. And it was in that moment when Jesus was at his physical weakest that the devil shows up to tempt Jesus astray. And I'm only going to mention the first temptation here, but this is an event I encourage you to study it on your own. You can find it in the 4th chapter of either Matthew or Luke's Gospel and read about those other two temptations. But the first temptation, it dealt with physical hunger and physical food. And that was when the devil saw that Jesus was famished, he makes the sly suggestion, well, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. And there's a lot packed into this temptation. It's a request for Jesus to prove his identity. If you are the Son of God, Satan says, then you can prove yourself, as if Jesus needs to prove himself. It's also inviting Jesus to use his power. That as the Son of God, he could do whatever he wanted with creation, and so there's a temptation there. But there's an underlying question too. It's a slippery slope. That Jesus was physically hungry, and he had the authority to meet that hunger, and he could say the word, and he could turn stones into bread. And if Jesus was willing to use his power to miraculously feed himself, then what about other people? Because the world is filled with hungry people, right? And if Jesus started miraculously turning stones into bread, not only could he feed all those people, but that would then be proof to those people that he was the Messiah. So it would be like a win-win. Feed hungry people and prove who Jesus was so that those people would believe in him. That's the temptation. Now, friends, imagine if that was the route that Jesus had gone, that his role as Messiah would be to constantly provide food to feed the world through a miracle every day, breakfast and lunch and dinner. Was that God's purpose in sending Jesus? And the answer is no. Now, this is where I want to pause and tempt you, if you'll allow the pun, that today's message is really part one of a two-part message, and that next week we're going to follow what happened next with the feeding of the 5,000. That a group of people, they follow after Jesus after this event, seeking after him, not because they wanted more teaching, but because they were looking for another free lunch. And those crowds looking for another free lunch, they reference the time when God did feed the people every day through a miracle. And that was the time that God provided manna for the Israelites in the wilderness. That was that bread from heaven that God gave as a daily miracle to sustain his people after they left Egypt. And so next week, we're going to dig into that theme of the difference between God providing a temporary meal and God providing eternity. That's next week. But this week, in reflecting on this first temptation, Jesus is being asked, are you going to use your power to meet physical hunger? And while that's important, Jesus' purpose in coming into the world wasn't to feed us a temporary lunch. He came to save us for all eternity, to give us future and a hope, a much bigger deal than a few free meals. Jesus, he hadn't come to provide a temporary lunch. He came to feed us with his eternal word. And that's hence his reaction to the devil's invitation. Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 8. One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so, friends, come back to that question of the feeding of the 5,000. And that query, what if there was no boy? What if no one shared? Because I think we'd be quick to assume, well, Jesus, he would just say the word, and he would turn stones into bread, and he would feed all the people. And yet we're reminded, that's not how Jesus worked. Instead, so often, Jesus, he worked through others, just like Jesus works through us today. And what's precious in the feeding of the 5,000 or the feeding of the 20,000 is on that day, Jesus, he worked through the gift of one small boy. One boy who gave everything he had to serve Jesus. And friends, the challenge for us, where is God inviting us to be like that boy? And to hear God's invitation to share, that God would take what we would give and he would multiply it, and he would feed a multitude. Where is God inviting you to be the one to kick off a miracle? That God will provide the miracle if you'll provide that initial sacrifice. That as you step out in faith, God will use you to jumpstart that miracle of multiplication, or that miracle of generosity, or that miracle of hope. And all God is waiting for is for our heart to be like the boy's heart. Sure, Jesus, here, take what I have. Take what I've brought. Take who I am. Let it begin with me. Church family, I invite you to hear God's invitation to be like the boy and share and give. And as you share, watch how Jesus multiplies what you give and who you are to reach beyond yourself and even to feed a multitude. Glory be to God today. Hello, I'm James Murphy, the pastor here at Cornerstone United Methodist Church. Thank you for watching this message. I encourage you, if you live in the Covington area or if you're visiting our neck of the woods, come by and worship God with us on a Sunday morning. Our current worship times are 9 a.m. and 10:45 a.m. We encourage you to visit our website for the most up-to-date information at www.buildingonjesus.org.